Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian.
Welcome to another live episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics, recorded at PyData New York 2024. Today, I'm excited to host a colleague who've become a friend, the great Aaron MacNeil, a professor of marine biology at Dalhousie University and head of the Integrated Fisheries Lab. Aaron shares the fascinating ways Bayesian statistics are transforming marine research, particularly in data-poor environments. We dive into the complexities of shark and ray conservation, exploring the often overlooked trade dynamics of the meat and the ecological importance of these species in maintaining healthy ocean ecosystems. Aaron also discusses the challenges of teaching Bayesian statistics to ecologists, highlighting the mindset shift required to embrace Bayesian methods. We further explore the role of expert elicitation, field data collection, and evidence-based decision-making in ecological modeling. From coral reef ecosystems in the Indo-Pacific to fisheries livelihoods globally, Aaron's work underscores the importance of balancing human and ecological needs through rigorous, data-driven approaches. This is Learning Bayesian Statistics, episode 127, recorded live on November 8, 2024.
Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. What's a Bayesian? It's someone who cares about evidence.
Welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics, a podcast about Bayesian inference, the methods, the projects, and the people who make it possible. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. For any info about the show, learnbayesstats.com is the place to be. Show notes, becoming a corporate sponsor, unlocking Bayesian merch, supporting the show on Patreon, everything is in there. That's learnbayesstats.com. If you're interested in one-on-one mentorship, online courses, or statistical consulting, feel free to reach out and book a call at topmate.io/Alex_Andorra. See you around, folks, and best Bayesian wishes to you all. And if today's discussion sparked ideas for your business, well, our team at PyMC Labs can help bring them to life. Check us out at pymc-labs.com.
Hello, my dear Bayesians. I wanted to let you know that I will be at a fun new conference on March 18, 2025. That's called Field of Play. It's going to be in Manchester, UK, and we're going to talk about sports analytics. So if you're into that, please join us. I am not going to give a talk this time, but much better, our dear Chris Fonsbeck, PyMC's BDFL, that you heard of very recently in the podcast. Well, Chris will be talking about Bayes in baseball, of course. And there are speakers from top Premier League football clubs, from Olympic winning teams, from academia. It's going to be fun, so feel free to get your tickets at fieldofplay.co.uk. The link is in the show notes. Okay, on to the show now.
Aaron MacNeil, welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. We're live again from PyData. Yeah, with a very quiet audience. I was testing, I'm not putting you in competition, but at StanCon, people were shouting and so on. So,
I think
you might want to,
they're on the edge of their seat.
increase the energy, No, so thanks a lot to everybody for being here. It's going to be super fun. I'm very happy to have you on the show, Aaron, because I've been working with you on the project we're going to talk about today. I've learned a lot. There's still a lot of things I don't know. So I'm really happy to be able to ask you all these questions and also talk about your career, because you have a very interesting career. I think a very inspiring one for people who are, wondering what they should do with their lives. So it's going to be super fun. So let's start. Yeah. Who are you, Aaron MacNeil? What's your job? What are you doing nowadays?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of marine biology in Dalhousie University. That's in Halifax and Nova Scotia. So that's east of Maine. And I run something called the Integrated Fisheries Lab. And we're called that because we're kind of a shop that solves kind of bespoke problems in conservation and management, typically for fisheries, but we work on other species as well. And basically, the idea is that, if people have a problem that they need some sort of an inference made on, or some sort of a projection or a decision, we're available to try to put something sensible together to help them solve problems, basically.
Yeah, yeah. And that's like everything fish or...
A lot of fish, but other things as well. I mean, I have a student who's working up in Haida Gwaii, that's in northern British Columbia on the coast, and there we're looking at the reintroduction of sea otters, which were decimated by the fur industry in the 19th century, and they're returning. And that's actually a problem because the way that laws are written for endangered species say you can't touch them, but the Haida have been living with those species for 40,000 years, and part of the way that they live with them is to harass them or kill them in certain bays so that they can maintain clam beds that society depends on. And so there's a real conflict there between the legislation that comes from the federal government and the traditional ways that those native people would have regulated their ecosystem. So our job is to go in there and show that actually they can keep doing what they always did, which is easy. They did it for 40,000 years. It's probably going to work again. But to be able to make that visible to something like a federal government, and that's, those types of problems, they do make you feel good because you do feel like you're helping people.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's also something I really like about your job is that it sounds on paper, you just like, you write papers, and then what happens with that? But no, actually you have a lot of, exchanges with the government in Canada and like local and federal, I'm guessing. And
local, federal, international. There's projects that we have, like the one we'll talk about today is an international project. And I think one of the great things about doing Bayesian statistics is that it fits. It's everything looks like a nail, but it's a really big hammer, and you can hit, particularly in data poor environments, which ecology is. It's probably the weakest form of science that you can do inferentially. But Bayesian methods really fit well with a huge range of problems.
Yeah. And I think that's like super inspiring in your work that we can take the results of the models and enlighten the policy making thanks to that. That's really, and the feedback loop is not that long.
Right.
So that's really great. Because something I learned a lot during the project, so the project was about sharks. And so like me, who didn't know anything about sharks before, I was like, okay, I don't know, my prior is that sharks are endangered, so you don't want to kill them. It's also because that's the predominant thing you hear on lots of most media, So, for instance, I'm French. There is this French island, beautiful, in the Indian Ocean called La Réunion, between Mauritius and Madagascar. Yeah, if you didn't get the opportunity to go, definitely recommend. Great for hiking. There is an incredible volcano. You cannot go to swim though, because there are a lot of sharks.
Bull shark.
Yeah, and bull sharks, which are they are not very kind to humans.
No, yeah.
Understood correctly, right?
Yeah. Bull sharks they're a really amazing species because they can live in freshwater. If you go to Lake Nicaragua, there are bull sharks in the lake, which is freshwater.
Well,
bull sharks can regulate the salt balance in their tissues more than other species. And the reason they can do that is because they're basically evolutionarily designed to go in and out of rivers and take things that are drinking and feeding by the river mouth. So they're particularly aggressive because of that kind of life history. And in Reunion, it's insane what's happened in Reunion. And one of the great surfing destinations of the world, and it's all been decimated by the bull shark population there.
Yeah. And so that kind of work is really interesting because that enlightens, well, sometimes you do want to touch some species because they are completely invasive and they're actually decimating the rest of the ecosystem. So that's, and also life, as you were talking with your students' project in Canada. So, but before we dive into the shark project, as usual, can you tell us how you came to do Bayesian stats? I know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
It's a really good one because that's...
Yeah. So, like all biologists, marine biologists, I avoided statistics like the plague. In fact, I failed my first year statistics class in the department in which I am now cross-appointed as a professor. So I like to say it's because I knew that the frequentist methods were BS, but so I avoided it like the plague. And then I did a master's in the University of Georgia, and there was a PhD student there called Chris Fonsbeck.
Mm-hmm.
And he was creating a package to do Bayesian analysis that was called PyMC.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, it was new to me at the time. And so he started me in on kind of showing me what it was. And through a comedy of errors, when I went to do my PhD in Newcastle in England, I made quantitative methods the subject of my PhD because it was intimidating. And I knew if I made it the subject of what I was doing, I wouldn't be intimidated by it at the end.
Hmm.
And Chris had sort of convinced me that this was a thing worth pursuing, the Bayesian methods. And so I learned it through PyMC. And I'm probably the longest user of PyMC in the world as a result of that. I've seen the evolution. And it's a pretty interesting because, learning by doing, I think, is a really important way to teach statistics. It's generally really badly taught. The analogy I use is it's badly taught in the same way that French is badly taught in Canada, which is you learn a bunch of rules and you never learn to speak. Mm-hmm. Whereas, the software that we have now, PyMC in particular, the way that you can kind of write down various distributions and put it all together. Yes, you may not understand likelihood theory or various other things, but provided you're given a few guardrails, you can start implementing Bayesian models easily. And then, as I did, I filled in the background knowledge afterwards. So I really learned using PyMC and applying it to problems in fisheries through my PhD and beyond.
Yeah, that's amazing because you used PyMC 1.
0.
PyMC 0.
Yeah, there wasn't even the beta version.
That's incredible. Yeah.
It was terrible.
Yeah. Chris is going to hear that,
It's okay. He knows. It was terrible. The difference, it's a thing that's hard for people who are just coming to it now to understand, but the pre-Hamiltonian sampling with Metropolis, there was one workshop I had in Zanzibar where I was getting results. I was in this sort of sweltering hotel room and my computer was just melting. Like it was so hot I couldn't touch it because I had to run a million iterations of some Metropolis algorithm, and so I'm, forever indebted to Chris for basically giving me my career through PyMC, but it was a lot harder to use. So that way.
Yeah. So as you can hear, also Aaron is doing workshops in very awful places in the world, like Zanzibar, the Galapagos. That's hot.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm curious. So HMC for you was like a big leap in the ability to use these methods. Is there another advance in PyMC since then that you've been blown away by?
Yeah. So, it's funny. So when I teach, Richard McElraith's book as a course, now.
I thought you were going to say I teach Richard McElraith.
Yeah. Everything he knows. And, I used to tell students they can use, Stan or PyMC at agnostic. And I used to tell them they're basically the same, just use whatever. Since the introduction of X-array, and particularly with our project, which is basically a fancy labeler, that has completely changed my life because I'm really bad for making careless mistakes. And when I would index things with numbers and the whole rest of it, and now to be able to just pull out things directly, it is insane how good X-array is when it's paired with PyMC.
Yeah.
That said, PyMC state space, which is just starting.
Right. Yeah, I see you.
Needs to get better because in fisheries, that's like one of the major places that state-based models were developed and are used all the time.
Yeah.
And so it's a place that we're tinkering with now, and we need to get better at.
That's good to know. Yeah. Well, state space is a special submodule of PyMC experimental that Jesse Grabowski developed all on his own. Jesse was on the show, so like I don't know which episode that's going to be, but it's going to be out in a few weeks. So if you're interested in that, definitely recommend listening to that. I talked a bit about state space models and Gaussian processes with Chris Fonsbeck. We recorded 2 days ago, so it's going to be out before your episode. Definitely recommend listening to that. Like when would you use a Gaussian processes versus state space models? But yeah, I see you keep you keep up to date with PyMC news, because state space is pretty new. So yeah, and that's really amazing. I've been also playing a bit with that at the Marlins, and probably I have some stuff I want to contribute. So hopefully that will help you. Yeah, especially vectorizing the time series. Because right now you cannot do that.
That's right.
If you wanted to do that for 100 shark species, you would have to create 100 separate models.
Yeah.
You might want to vectorize that.
Yeah.
But damn, amazing. And yeah, that's some X-ray is a great point, because that's something I tell my students all the time, is that I know it's frustrating to be like, I just want to run models, and I don't really want to learn something that seems tangential to that, because X-ray is basically a multi-dimensional pandas. But that's one of the best investment you can make.
Hands down.
Because afterwards, because actually most of your time in the model development is not really writing the model. It's diving into the model before, when you have to do prior predictive sampling, and then afterwards when you have to confirm that the model is not nonsense, or more precisely to check where the model is nonsense.
Yeah.
And for that, X-ray is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and we, in my lab in particular, but in science in general, we make, or in ecology in general, we make pretty bespoke figures using the posteriors, and the ability to go in and pull a species out, or to put extra labels on groups of species and then pull out the posterior for the group is just, it's incredible.
Yeah, because to make that clear to people, like basically what you get, for instance, let's say you have a parameter in your model that's like call that the shark effect. That's a cool name. And so you have 10,000 sharks, let's say, and you have that through time. Let's say you have 10 years of data on that one. So that's already, without anything else in the model, that's 4 chains, 1,000 draws per chain, 1,000 sharks, and 10 years for each shark. So that's 4-dimensional vector. Before, when you were using NumPy, you had to isolate and, column, then column, and then you were indexing with a number. Whereas right now you can just say dot cell, you say dot cell shark equals dog shark, and then boom, you have what you care about. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
But I know that's a bit frustrating, because that's not sexy at all, right?
Yeah, but the results are. It's totally worth it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Custom plots. That's the thing to do.
Yeah.
And actually, since we're talking a bit about teaching before diving into the shark stuff, I'm curious if there is, a common mistake or hurdle that you see your students having when you teach them Bayesian stats, that if they knew about that would accelerate, jumpstart their learning?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, McElraith's book is called Statistical Rethinking for a reason, and it's basically requiring people to somewhat discard the rules that they were taught in their undergraduate course. And I think for people to come in with a fresh mind, I think is the biggest thing. The hurdle that I find, even sort of halfway through the course, you still find people, benchmarking their results against stuff that they know, and that's natural to do that. But I think the mentality about explaining variances and the obsession with that, as if that's the only thing that's worth doing, it pervades ecology. I don't know about other disciplines, but that's a really big problem. And so getting people to discard that sort of thinking and then move into a sort of causal mentality is a big deal. That causal words are kind of a taboo in ecology. And, when in reality, it's kind of what everybody's doing. So it's this sort of Victorian behind the scenes. There's people who are doing something and they're showing something out front that's different. So one of my biggest jobs teaching people is to give people permission to use causal language. And Bayesian models really help with that because, we're able to say, well, look, this, priors are about your belief and what you think. And then we're going to confront that with some data. We're going to see what the conclusions are. And just changing the mentality is a big deal. So I think if somebody's starting out in a Bayesian context, getting them to think in really general terms about what they're trying to do when they're running models and trying to, particularly in science and ecology, where we're often doing inference, it's okay to be doing that, to give themselves permission to do that and to kind of discard the sort of rules that are prescribed when you do undergraduate statistics. I think it's a big deal.
Yeah, it makes sense. So because like your students are like, they are coming from undergrad, so they already have a bit of knowledge about stats, right? Okay. Yeah, in a way, that's the worst. That's the worst you can get, right? Because you'd prefer people like students who don't know anything. That way, it's just a blank page, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, and I mean, what's shocking about undergraduate statistics is that they'll come through that discipline and have no idea what a likelihood is, and you think, well, it's not actually that complicated to know what a likelihood is. It's just numbers. You substitute them into an equation, you get a number at the end. Like, that should be the foundation of what they're taught. And yet it's all about, working through these sort of golems that McElroy talks about, working through these rules. And that's where they get reassurance is in the rules. They don't get it in the knowledge of the system itself. And it's a mentality problem.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. So sharks, Aaron, like, why? No, that's a provocative question, but I get that question quite a lot when I talk about that project.
Yeah.
It's like, why do you care about sharks?
Yeah. I mean, so I started in looking at them because they were cool. And I was an undergrad and I wanted to be cool. And so I started working on sharks.
Yeah.
And my career, my sort of reputation has actually made it primarily in coral reef fisheries, which is much more sort of important for people in their lives. But the sharks came back to me later on through some colleagues and collaborators who are doing conservation work. And the reason that it's important is because, on average, sharks in the open ocean declined around 90 to 95% in the last half of the 20th century. And that was due to overfishing from longlining. So going for things like tunas and billfish and things. And 90% declines in any species is a big deal. And the question that motivated me in shark research is, does it matter? If they're just up there at the top of the food chain, just picking the cream off the top, then maybe it doesn't matter. We know from sort of lions on the Serengeti that that's probably not true. Lions, if they're not there, they fail to control the antelope populations, the grass ecosystem collapses. So predators in ecosystems have these functional roles where they actually are a key to how the whole ecosystem works. So if we want healthy oceans, and healthy oceans are the ones that are going to be most productive for human society, then we want to have them functioning really well. And so sharks are an important component of that. And they're a fascinating, beautiful, 65 million year old species. So they're pretty cool to work on.
Yeah, their evolution is just incredible. Like all the time when we have the workshops, like I learn new facts about shark evolution from you and Chris and the whole team. Is just like, these animals are incredible. Like, do I remember correctly that they don't have any skeleton?
Yeah, so they don't have bones. They have cartilage, and cartilage, as you may or may not know, but it has a lot of spring to it, and so it's a way of for them to be very efficient in the ocean in terms of how they're moving around.
But yeah, so what I really like also in how you motivate, like how you were motivating naturals, so in the whole group you have working on that, is that you guys are very evidence driven. So that's really cool because I don't want people listening to that thinking that, oh yeah, basically like you're here to protect sharks no matter what. And even if the evidence tells you that No, here that's fine. It's like it's normal. You want kind of a Goldilocks zone, as you were saying. Not too many top predators, but also not too little.
Yeah.
So that I learned from interacting with you, and I think that's very important because in these fields you kind of have also these extremist view of it's like you cannot touch anything, and actually that's not always the optimal solution to do.
Well, and I think if you ran a hotel in Reunion, that's a really good case, right? Where was it Brigitte Bardot that came there and just said you can't touch sharks and their majesty and stuff, and bull sharks are not threatened anywhere in the world. The fact that people can't recreate in the ocean has completely decimated the tourism industry in Reunion. I think it's rational to cull those sharks for a good that has to do with the population that lives there. That may be an unpopular opinion amongst shark conservationists, but yeah, we try to walk the line as much as possible of rational decision making and trying to understand that, other people have different values than we do. And how can we make decisions that are going to see the most benefit for people and for ecosystems?
Yeah. And that's also why I think it's very interesting, because your Bayesian models really feed into that, how to make the most optimal decision based on what the evidence say. So because that being said, there are a lot of species of sharks, and some of them are really endangered, but some of them are not. And I think that's where the project we worked on, is interesting to talk about because, can you explain this project? Like, give us the elevator pitch, what we're doing in the paper, and
sure,
and what this is all about.
Yeah. So at an international level, the way that shark conservation operates is often through agreements that are made among countries, particularly around trade. So you have CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And that regulates, for example, you can't take ivory across a border. And so CITES is the instrument that regulates that trade.
Yeah.
With this project is about looking at meat that gets traded for sharks and rays around the world. And right now that trade happens just as meat. There's no species labels on it at all. And we know, just because we know what gets landed, that a huge proportion of that trade is actually in species that are listed under CITES and are not reported in the way that they're legally required to be. So it's an illegal trade in shark meat. And so the question that we had, or we were presented with, is, can we figure out a way to decompose that trade into species? And it kind of was brought to me as a problem, and I'm not somebody that knew anything about compositional data. And so I thought, but I thought, well, it's a decent amount of work to do this, but it's an interesting problem. And so we took it on, and it was stressful because it was beyond my ability, just beyond my ability to do so. But as a result, I've learned a lot about how to decompose things and how to build up compositions in a sensible way. So it's it's worked out.
Yeah, that was a very very hard project, and I know you've lost a bit of sleep from time to time because the model wasn't running.
It wasn't running. I mean, there are just so many hidden dimensions to this because when things get reported to international authorities, first of all, you have landings of species, and those get some reported to species, but they also get reported at these kind of aggregated taxonomic levels. So you may get reported at the genus level or the family level or the class or whatever. And so how do you sensibly decompose those aggregations into the constituent species? Because it's going to vary depending on what the aggregated category is. Some species could be in that category and a bunch of species are not in that category. And so there's a kind of taxonomic hierarchy that we had to take into account. And of course, the whole thing is probabilistic. So it's all about, well, probably it's this or that in the end.
Yeah. So we'll dive into the nitty-gritty in the model in a minute. But first, depending on where you're from in the world, you could be completely surprised about the fact that there is a trade of shark meat, because that means people eat shark.
Yeah.
which is like, at least to me as a French educated person, was really surprising. So yeah, can you tell to people?
Well, because you're not from the coast, you're not from Normandy.
Yeah, I know.
So France is one of the largest consumer of ray meat in the world.
Ray, that.
Yeah. And so, and I guess one of the most important species in this whole thing is spiny dogfish. And spiny dogfish is fished in the North Atlantic and fished in New Zealand as well. It occurs all over the place. And it's the number one species for fish and chips. So if anybody's been to Europe, Belgium, the UK, even Australia to some extent, if you're eating fish and chips, you're mostly eating shark. And that's the number one species or group that is in the fish and chip trade. So there are really meat-focused species that we do know something about, and we can incorporate that sort of information into the models.
Yeah. But that was like really mind-blowing to me to learn that, because like lots of shark is actually eaten, so trade of shark meat is not negligible. But often, at least depending on where you are in the world, it's not marketed as shark meat because it's not.
Right.
It's clearly not attractive.
Yeah.
So most of the time you don't know fish and chips. The fish in fish chips and chips is actually shark and chips.
Yeah.
Well, that's a cool name. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, and I think somewhat, because I had the same reaction, somewhat that's our own ignorance culturally.
Yeah, I mean,
and so
completely.
Yeah. And so, in South America and Brazil, there's very specific dishes that are clearly identified as shark. In India, there's a certain size range of coastal sharks that are very important culturally, and something that, say, pregnant women are culturally eating. So I think, one of the things about this project is a lot of work in the past 20 years has focused on shark fins and shark fin soup and how that's driven overexploitation, but to the detriment of people thinking about meat. And the fact that actually the original reason people were catching these animals was for meat. And so let's take a look at that. And it's worth, $1 billion more than the fin trade industry. So meat is a big deal.
Yeah, I know for sure. And so, like, do you already have some results from the model in that how the trade between countries and across species is done to share with us today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing to note is that the trade in ray meat is just as large as the trade in shark meat. It's actually a little bit larger. And that's surprising to people, but it's much more concentrated. So, for example, there is a species of skate, which is a kind of ray that is in Argentina, and enormous volumes of this are being traded to South Korea, which is the largest importer of ray meat in the world. So that ray meat is going to very few markets, whereas the shark meat is a much more global market and is much more diverse in terms of the species that are involved. I think, another surprising aspect is, so about 40% of the meat trade is blue shark. Do you remember the species name?
Is that Prionace glaucius?
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. He's got it.
Yeah.
But the rest of the trade is composed of some 90 to 100 other species. And so it's a really diverse trade that's happening. And it rotates depending on how things get exploited or overexploited. So we're seeing, a lot of species will be fished, they'll get overexploited, and then fishers will move on to other species. And so there's a lot of exchangeability of species within the market that is really important.
Yeah. And so how did you end up having these insights, right? Like, what does the model look like? Were you able to fit the model on sharks and rays at the same time? Do you have any hierarchy on that? What does the model look like?
Yeah, all of that. So sharks and rays are, as a group, called elasmobranchs, so the cartilaginous fishes, and they'll sometimes get traded as elasmobranchs. So we had to have a model that could jointly estimate both groups. And then the other thing, I think, which is particularly Bayesian here, is that we have, in order to figure out what's in the trade, we first had to figure out what was in the landings. And landings are reported sometimes to the species level and sometimes to these aggregated levels. And in order to figure that out in any given country, we had about 65 countries that we were looking at, and we don't know everything in every country. And so the first thing we had to do is to get a sense from experts about what the composition of the species are in each country. in terms of landings.
Yeah.
And so that's an elicited prior. And
Mm-hmm.
this estimation that we're doing, you couldn't do without those priors, because in places where, say for China, for example, doesn't report anything to anybody except at an aggregated level, it's impossible to know what the species composition is without some expert opinion about what the composition would be in the landings. And so really the anchor of this whole project was to be able to figure out what the priors are in the landings, and to have something sensible to say there, and then propagate that information through the model. And the great thing about this sort of hierarchical decomposition is that, sometimes you do actually know what the species are. And so, your priors are overwhelmed in those cases. But in places where you don't know, this is what you have. And, I think when the results come out, a country like China could say, oh, you have it totally wrong in terms of this composition. And we could say, great, then start reporting the composition of the species in your landings, and we'll correct this thing. So we're not, in the work we're doing, we're not finger pointing and saying you're doing this or you're doing that. We're saying, what is the current state of knowledge of this system for us? And Bayesian modeling really is the only way that we would be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I find fascinating in this model, is that you have so many pieces together. Like, first, as you were saying, the priors are very important here, because there are some combinations of countries and species that you don't have data on. And also you have two models in one, right? Like you have the model for the landings, and then you have the model for the trade. And the results of the model for landings are fed into the other model that tries to infer the trade between countries, right? So how
does that work?
Yeah. How does that work? How did you do this?
So basically, the way it's set up is that we have a kind of latent state, which is a species by country matrix for the landings, and so that is the thing we're really trying to estimate. And the certain cells of that matrix are hard zeros. We know that that it's an impossible combination of things.
Yeah.
And so we developed a technique that is throughout the model of masking, where we are using either 1-0 or negative number masking, depending on the context, to actually wink out certain nodes within that latent matrix, so that none of the catch can be allocated to that cell, and it gets allocated only to the cells that have some prior information involved. And so through the landings model, where we estimate this latent landings thing, we then have the problem of, okay, we know that there's this much of these species in this country. How do you then trade that out into the world? Because, as a basic assumption, you could say, well, equally, whatever the distribution is by species in a country and its landings, it just equally trades that out into the world. But that's not particularly satisfying. It doesn't seem right. Probably the only clever insight I had in this whole project was I woke up in a yurt in Cape Breton in about 2:30 in the morning one winter.
On purpose, right?
It was a thing that was bothering me, obviously, and I woke up in the middle of the night. This is about 2 years into the project, and we were on a ski trip with my kids, and I realized that my subconscious realized that the composition of species that any given importer wants to trade is going to imply some sort of correlation in the exporters that they trade with. So if I'm France and I want Raja clavata, is a really common European species, I'm going to have larger volumes of trade, which we know, with countries that have that species. So there's an implied correlation there for any given importer in terms of who they trade with and the amount of volume, that those exporters will all have correlations in terms of their species that they care about. So this is a variable that we call import preferences. And it works. So countries that we know have a lot of fish and chips, the European countries, are trading more with countries that have a lot of dogfish. Right? And with the rays and so forth. And then we have other parts of the trade model that deal with, trade volumes of seafood, that, countries are more likely to trade with each other if they have high seafood volumes and so forth. But basically, we tried to come up with some covariates for trade, as well as potentially more expert information that would help us take the landings and send them out into countries in a sensible way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And how do you handle that correlation, that matrix of correlation? Like where do you estimate that correlation at inference time, or you have hard coded the correlation between the trait preference of two given countries?
Yeah. So given how big this thing is already, I didn't go a kind of multivariate normal way. We might do later on. But right now what we have is for any given species, for an importer, for all of the various species, we simply estimate an effect size so that if that species is available with countries that they trade with, you're going to see a larger trade volume with that effect, basically.
Okay, yeah. No. Yeah, it's just like you have a slope per combination, per pair.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a lot of parameters.
Brutal.
Because also this is not symmetric, right? So you would have one parameter for France and Spain and another for Spain and France.
Yeah. Well, for the species, the desirability of any given species, it's really species by importer. So France cares about a particular array of species, and Spain cares about a different array of species, basically.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's where that's amazing. Yeah.
And without X-array, keeping track of all this would be impossible.
Right.
Basically.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah. But no, I mean, that's amazing. Well done. And like getting all of these together, that's just incredible.
Yeah.
So you've talked about one of these things already, but I'm curious, given the side of the model in the project, what is the hardest obstacle you had to overcome? What was the biggest thing that kept you up at night?
Well, delivering the project, definitely. It's funny, at some point during this process, I may have said even to you at one of our workshops, like, I feel like we're just doing sums, right? This is just fancy adding and subtracting. And you kind of said, yeah, but it's pretty fancy. And so, I think making sure that we get things added up correctly in a project that has so many dimensions, and those dimensions are not symmetric. So the combination of species in a country is just varies by every single country, and making all the addition of those distributions add up correctly. Yeah. It was just mind-blowing. And one of the problems that we had is when you're doing compositional data, some countries would aggregate, they'd have one aggregated category, or they would have two aggregated categories. Most countries would have three or more aggregated categories. So depending on which country you fall into, that implies either a softmax or some sort of Dirichlet breakdown with some multinomial, or it implies a binomial, or it implies just a 1-0 flag of possible. And so doing that automatically and having it all sum up correctly, you just have these, it's just the detail was just extraordinary. And it's crazy that it can take years to make that detail correct. But you'd see the results and you'd realize, oh no, we have a leakage somewhere in this system, and you'd have to go back and really think about those details. So it was a lot of really just buttoning up all the leakages so that the distribution of species could flow through the system. That
sounds a lot like what I'm doing at the moment with baseball players. And what's amazing also I found is that you have several likelihoods in the model. And that's a question I often have from people like, how do I do if I have several likelihoods? Just add them to the model.
Well, it's amazing. It's a thing I haven't even mentioned is we have a whole field program where we went to countries that had the most landings in the world, and we sampled their landings and actually had field data that we incorporated. And that field data, as you're saying, all it is it feeds back into this latent landings matrix that we're estimating, and it's just more information. And so the ability to take, again, for the Bayesian analysis, the ability to take expert information, field data, the structure of how trade happens, all of it gets integrated together with however many likelihoods you need. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it any other way.
Yeah. And so before opening to some questions from the audience, how's the model running? How do you run such a model? What's the running time? Did you have difficulties running such
Yeah, we have. We have. And it's a thing where we had to go in and figure out how to send all the samples to a back end, because basically the computers that we have were sort of melting. I don't have it on some gigantic machine. I think we will. That'll be a next step with our computer science department, is to get it happening all together. But basically we had to we had to take the landings model and run that, and then take the posteriors for the latent landings and apply it to the trade model separately. And that worked pretty well. And we can run, a few hundred, 500 samples or something with a decent, tuning period, in a day or something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not too bad.
Yeah.
But things blow up quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how did you handle that? Like if it takes one day to get an iteration of the model, how do you practically do model development, without?
Yeah, chunking things up is a big thing. And then also, again, Hamiltonians are so insane that, I could run 50 samples and I'm not getting that much of a posterior difference to when I run 1,000.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. It just goes straight to the peak or the valley, whatever.
Yeah, tuning is good.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Tuning went well.
Tuning goes well.
Yeah.
So that's been a big advantage.
Yeah.
So
running
small and then going to sleep with it running in the background, basically. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and so I think you might want to try running that on a GPU, because like basically a huge matrix.
Yeah.
So you could try a sparse matrix.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to. I need to see the latest code, but then you would probably have to modify the code so that you could use PyTensor's sparse operations and then run that. But even without that, you could try that on a GPU already.
Yeah.
And with PyMC now, it's super simple, because you could either specify pm.sample net sampler equals numpyro. And if you're on a GPU, it's going to detect it automatically and use that. And that should be way faster. Otherwise, you can also use netpy. So I don't know if you followed that development, but
no.
So netpy is the re-implementation of Hamiltonian Monte Carlo in Rest.
Oh, right.
Adrian Zabel did that like as a hobby. So Adrian is the one who came up with the zero-sum normal,
right?
That we use a lot in the project.
Yeah.
So he did that, and that's way faster. Also, he's got some new fancy tuning adaptation algorithm.
Nice.
So tuning is faster and better. So you need only like 300 tuning draws, whereas in the default PyMC sampler it's 1,000.
Yeah.
So that's way faster.
Yeah.
And you can use NetPy with the JAX backend. And so if you're on a GPU, that's gonna
send it over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you can get access to a GPU at Dalhousie, that should be efficient and worth your time. Yeah.
Great.
Nice. Any questions already from the audience? Yeah, sir. What's your name? So, beautiful name. I like that. So Dante is asking about the different likelihoods you have in the model, and basically, if I understand correctly, how you cut that up, basically how that looks like, is one feeding into the other.
Yeah, they're jointly, because the inference we're trying to make is kind of a joint inference. Like we care about combining the knowledge together with the data to get our best estimate of what this latent matrix is. And so that is the composition of things is really the key part to this whole thing. And that composition applies to both parts of the likelihoods. And so essentially we're using the same latent part of the model to indicate the species composition that could be in the trade data and in our field data. And so it's simply a question of coding it up that way, where the parent distributions in the hierarchy are going to be the same parent distributions, basically. Yeah.
So, follow-up question from Dante. Basically, the observations, are they like, do you observe the landings? Do you observe the trade? How does that work?
Yeah. So the trade is just meat. So we have the volume of trade, but we don't have anything about the composition. So the compositions are informed in three main ways. One is the priors from experts. The second is in field data that we went out and surveyed. And the third one is in reported data. So the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations has a fish group, and every country that lands fish reports to them every year what they've landed. That reporting can happen at different levels. Sometimes it's at the species level. The United States, Canada, we report to these things. Vietnam and China report nothing. And every country in between. And so that data, some of it's at the species level, some at the genus level, some at the class level, like it goes up and up and up. And the structure of that reporting implies what species the composition could be. So there's volumes of Elopidae, which is the thresher sharks. There's only 3 species. So the model, what it has to do is, based on our field data and expert opinion, it has to allocate that tonnage of reported Elopidae to those 3 possible species, depending on the priors and on the data itself. So it's kind of all together, but it happens in the landing side of the model because the trade data doesn't have any species composition in it. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, the results are, deal with those discrepancies, deal with the hierarchy. They also, which I didn't talk about, there's of course, French economists who give reliability data for things that are reported to international organizations. And so we have a score that they've created for each country, each exporter. And we actually model the uncertainty in their reporting based upon this score. So countries that are more reliable would have more certainty about what they're reporting.
Yeah, that's true. That's a cool part of the model. We're modeling the standard deviation. So, like your observational noise, for instance, in a normal likelihood. We're not only modeling the mu, we're modeling the sigma, and that sigma is a regression. Yeah. It's like the sigma depends on the reliability score of the countries. Yeah. So that's really good. And that's like another really cool stuff of Bayesian model where often you have people like, how do you deal with heteroscedasticity? So it's like if your sigma depends on features of the data, you just model it, and that's a really cool thing. Yeah. Great. Happy, Dante? Great. Yeah. Other question? Yeah, Jeff, of course. Yeah. So Jeff asks, how do you do the prior elicitation, Aaron, with so many parameters?
Right to the heart of the matter. Yeah. What we're eliciting is, so you have fisheries experts in every country who have some sense of what the catch composition is for these species. There aren't that many shark experts in the world. And so I sit on something called the Shark Specialist Group what is it called? For the UN. And the IUCN, the International Conservation Union of the UN. And so we have experts in each country that know what the composition is. And so we're asking them a pretty simple question, which is, how much of these things do you get? Do you get never see it, rarely see it? It's on a sort of Likert scale. And then we've translated that into a log odds, basically. And that's what goes into the prior. Now, the real problem with that process is, of course, how certain are they about their scores? And we don't have that in there yet. It's actually a hard problem. I haven't found a really good example of people doing this kind of elicitation. I've seen some stuff in the computer science literature related to like market surveys with products. But in expert elicitation, you need, the mean, but then you need the uncertainty about that mean, and you need to construct a good prior in that way. And we have not done that. We just have these log odds, and we have basically a standard deviation of 3 that goes into a multinomial. And there's been enough trial and error over 3 or 4 years that we know that we've tried bigger or smaller, and we've kind of seen what the consequences are for the way the model is. And so we've just by iteratively going through, we've kind of tuned that uncertainty, but it's one of the things that we need to work on for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, great. I still have some.
Yeah.
So, yeah, want to have, Aaron, is that, so we'll put in the show notes any link we can at the time we have the episode out. So hopefully the preprint, very probably also the GitHub repo, because all the code is going to be available in open source. So that's the great thing with a huge PIMC model for you guys to check out. Are you going to be able to share the data too?
Yeah,
okay.
It's all open data. Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah,
what a great project.
Yeah.
So yeah, like natural question, what's the next step in that project for you?
Yeah, so we have a project that our postdoc Chris Mull has got put together to look at the ways in which different countries are exporting their ecological footprint related to sharks. So that's upcoming in January. And then over the next sort of 4 or 5 years, our long-term goal is to look at how various management interventions have changed the landings composition. So in other words, thinking causally, have things like fin retention bans or just retention bans in general actually had an effect on the landings. So does international conservation work is kind of the question we have. And that's a really big one. And it's going to have implications for any wildlife trade. So that's super exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. Probably interrupted time series, analysis, stuff like that. So causal inference coming your way.
Yep.
Nice. And other question is, you're a very curious guy, so I always love asking you that question. But what are you learning these days? What are you curious about? What are you, reading about? Things like that.
Oh, I guess, what am I reading right now? Well, the book I'm reading right now on the plane here is about, it's called The Honest Broker, and it's about the role of scientists in informing policy. And so particularly at universities, there is often a real appetite to be an advocate, to really advocate hard for conservation or hard for something. And having spent 10 years with the Australian government, I kind of see the value of not doing that and trying to, provide people, particularly politicians, people who are making decisions, with an understanding of the field and what the options are and what the consequences of various decisions are. And that to me is a very important area that science can inform policy. And so this book, The Honest Broker, is really about that. And so I think as I'm sort of becoming more senior in my job, I want to make sure I'm doing a good job advising people who are coming to us for advice. And that's a really big one. And I guess the other thing is, I just read a book on Dirac's life.
Oh, yeah?
And totally fascinating. I mean, it's very hard. I give a talk about the conservation consequences of the atomic bomb. And one of the dimensions of that is, of course, the methods that we use, right? A lot of stuff in MCMC, of course, came out of the Manhattan Project. But also, if you go to Bikini Atoll, right, where the French did their nuclear tests, it's one of the most beautiful coral reefs in the world. And it's because after those tests finished, nobody went there. And it's a bit like Chernobyl is the same thing. If you go to Chernobyl, it's just a wildlife paradise, and yet it's on the back of this kind of nuclear disaster. So there's all these weird kind of conservation benefits of war. And so just thinking about all the things that happened, what a fertile time in science. Even though it's horrific what was created, it's incredible also at the same time.
And that's also a good reminder that you need Causal's thinking in your model, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, just an AI model will tell you, well, actually, to preserve wildlife, you need to
blow them up.
And you go. So that's good to think causally, right? Awesome. So to close up the show, Aaron, as usual, the last 2 questions I ask every guest. So first one, if you had unlimited time and resources, which problem will you try to solve?
I mean, it's impossible not to say climate change. I mean, and I say that everybody kind of says this, but I do it because a lot of my work has been on coral reefs, and coral reefs are, like the Arctic, are at the bounds of temperature. And coral reefs are spilling into temperatures that haven't existed for a long time on the Earth. And so they're the most threatened by climate change alongside Arctic ecosystems, which of course they're moving in a different direction away from freezing. And so seeing the consequences of climate change with coral bleaching and the effects on people and communities, it's just, enormous. And so it has to be the thing that we work on. And from a people perspective, not just from an environment perspective.
Yeah. And second question, if you could have dinner with any great scientific mind, dead or alive, fictional, who would it be?
Dennis Lindley.
Okay, that was prepared.
Well, I've thought about it, yeah. And it's because he was an early Bayesian, and he came through the war, became a statistician through the war, and again, all the war people, I mean, Feynman and von Neumann, all these people would be really interesting. What I really would like to hear about his war experience, but also he confronted Fisher. And Fisher was an asshole. And not enough people know that, because as Lindley said, he was a brilliant man, but he was an awful person. And I think it's really important to understand that. And, Aubrey Clayton illustrates this beautifully in his book.
Yeah. Bernoulli's fallacy.
Bernoulli's fallacy. That
episode 50 of the podcast.
Yeah.
From Aubrey Clayton directly.
And, he outlines not only the fallacy, but also the context under which, Galton and Pearson and Fisher were operating was not neutral. And their dominance and arrogance over everybody in statistics, which is what I live now with the students that I teach, back to talking about students and trying to have a fresh mind. Everything is so prescribed in statistics because of these people, and not only because of them, but because of their bad actions and their bad intentions. And I think talking to Lindley about that idea and how he kind of fought Fisher and what it was like to be in that position would just be super fascinating. And from all intents that I can tell, he was a really nice man as well.
Yeah. Great answer. And you're the first one to answer that. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for taking the time. That was as awesome as I expected. So yeah, thank you so much. Learned a lot. Well, you're welcome anytime on the show for the next paper.
All right.
And thank you everybody for joining us live here.
Thanks everybody.
So actually we had a great question afterwards, after the show, that I should have asked but didn't. So we're recording that bonus. So Shalom actually asked Aaron if there were any counterintuitive finding in the results from the study.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is just the diversity of the trade itself. So if you look at the literature right now on sharks that are caught, it's mostly pelagic species like blue sharks, thresher sharks, things like that are out in the open ocean caught on long lines. And those are what you see in the fin trade a lot. But once we kind of dealt with those species, it's the diversity of other species, the fact that the meat trade basically permeates the whole world. And anywhere that people are catching these animals, they're eating them. And then that is then ending up in international trade was really surprising, the diversity. Yeah.
This has been another episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Be sure to rate, review, and follow the show on your favorite podcatcher, and visit learnbayesstats.com for more resources about today's topics, as well as access to more episodes to help you reach true Bayesian state of mind. That's learnbayesstats.com. Our theme music is Good Bayesian by Baba Brinkman, feat. MC Lars and Megaran. Check out his awesome work at bababrinkman.com. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. You can support the show and unlock exclusive benefits by visiting patreon.com/learnbayesstats. Thank you so much for listening and for your support. You're truly a
good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change calculations after taking fresh data in. Those predictions that your brain is making, let's get them on a solid foundation.